time, I finally want to do my Charlotte Tilbury palette ranking. I've been wanting to do this video for years. I'm finally sitting down to do it. I have 12 palettes in front of me, and a little bit about these palettes. These palettes used to have a chokehold on me. I'm absolutely in love with like the kind of fairy-like soft makeup eye that they give, and I'm still in love with them, but I admit I'm wearing eyeshadow palettes way less since end of 2023. I'm getting ready to start doing a major declutter for my channel, and I just really want to sit down and really rank these palettes according to how I feel about them. Now, none of the palettes that you see here are complete duds. I actually think that all of the palettes that I have in front of me have redeeming qualities. I don't have all of the Charlotte Tilbury palettes, but having 12, I definitely have a few. So let's start with my number 12. My number 12 is ranking this low simply because I don't like the color story, and it's the Walk of No Shame palette. Definitely sort of this off kind of red tone palette. The nice thing about this palette, and like most of these luxury eyeshadow palettes that she has, is they're like one complete look. So you have an inner corner shade. Usually she calls them the prime shade. So she tells you how to use them on the back. You see the 1, 2, 3, 4. And usually these come with a prime shade. This is often my inner corner shade. An enhanced shade, so a shade where you enhance the eye, contour the eye. You have a smoke shade. This is often the shade that she uses to smoke out the outer corners. And then you have a pop shade. This is typically your kind of sparkling topper shade. And the pop is often a very sheer, non-opaque, kind of glittery eye topper. I really enjoy the pop shades from Charlotte Tilbury, and this is a typical Charlotte Tilbury setup. The reason it's ranking at number 12 is I don't pull for a red color story. I got this with a gift of purchase from the website, so I personally would have never purchased this. It's still a beautiful palette, so if this is your color story, maybe you're a deeper complexion and you like these type of red tones, then actually this is not a bad palette to have. It's a complete palette, it's beautiful. I don't pull for this because of the color story. Then on 11th position, another great palette to have. I feel like this one is ranking a little lower because it's not very memorable, and it's this one. This is the Queen of Glow palette. It's a warm toned sunset type of palette, and again, you're gonna get a prime shade, an enhance, a smoke, and a pop shade. I do think that the pop shade isn't very poppy in this one. It definitely looks like there's 3 metallics in here, and you can get a very warm toned sunset eye with this one. This is a color story that I see a lot of brands have. Like if you're really going into it, especially luxury beauty shadows, you're gonna find like that Tom Ford, Victoria Beckham Beauty, all of them have a color story just like this, so it's not a very memorable color story in my opinion. It is ranking this low because I just forget about it. This is a palette that is, in my opinion, forgettable. I pull for other palettes way more than this one, but it's a beautiful palette nonetheless. You can get a really beautiful look out of it, and it's well performing if you're liking a soft, smoky eye look. It is a well performing warm tone palette if that's your thing. Then on 10th spot, I debated putting this on 10th spot. I think this ranking changes for me all the time, like tweaks a little bit here and there, but this next one is a cool tone palette by Charlotte Tilbury. I think it is loved by many, but I'll tell you a little bit why it's ranked this low. This is the Golden Goddess palette. Now the Golden Goddess palette is one that often people seem to really enjoy. It's more of a cool tone palette. I don't know why it's called a Golden Goddess palette, because this is more like a taupey palette. And there's some really great shadows in here. First off, it has a really great prime shade for the inner corner. If you want to do a good inner corner highlight, this is a really great prime shade. It has a great tone enhanced shade. This is a very great tone. So you're gonna have a more cool tone pulling look. A really beautiful kind of chocolate brown, a little bit more cool toned as well, and a very beautiful bronzy topper. These 3 shades all together will give you a beautiful latte makeup eye look. I actually did it on my channel once because I really wanted to demo this palette. My one issue is with this palette, if I use all of the shades together, it can look almost muddy. Like I feel like the colors like to blend together. They don't want to stand out on its own. And I don't get a very beautiful cohesive look out of this one. When I use this palette and I leave out the gray shade, it gives a much more flattering look on me. So I typically don't tend to use one of these shades. Since these palettes do retail for 53 euros, or I think $55 now, it's a little bit too expensive of a palette for me to recommend if I don't use one of the shades, if you know what I mean. It is a favorite amongst many of you guys, so if you are looking for a neutral, cool toned leaning palette, this might be the one for you. It has a really great topper, probably one of the best toppers or pop shades out there when it comes to these palettes. I just don't think that the palette in itself is cohesive enough for an everyday eye look. Then on ninth spot, I absolutely adore this palette. I have a lot of sentimental value with this palette. I think it's the first Charlotte Tilbury palette I've ever owned, the first review I ever written online about makeup. This is before I even started my channel, and it's this one. It's a limited edition palette, so you can't get it anymore, but it's the Super Blue palette. Oh my god, this is such a freaking stunning palette. This launch basically talked about color theory, and it said that for brown tone eyes, this is the palette that you should get to make your brown tone eyes pop. The blues in here really make my brown tone eyes pop. Every time I wear this, I get compliments. And what I loved about this palette was I could use these two top shadows only to get an everyday eye look. I used to have a minimalist makeup collection, like extreme minimalist makeup collection, and I'd wear these two top ones just for an everyday eye look, and I'd wear the bottom row when I was doing a like nighttime look. I love this palette. I have sentimental feelings about this palette. Like, I fell in love with Charlotte Tilbury, and I wanted to get one of these palettes, and I thought about like spending at the time 50 euros for one of these palettes, and this is the one that I was going for. Now, why it's ranking at number 9 and not higher is for two things. One, my preferences have changed in makeup. Like, you don't see me wearing blue eyeshadows anymore. I don't tend to pull for the blues that much anymore, so it's kind of like something that is just laying and collecting dust in my collection. I still really like the quality of this palette. I think out of all the palettes, the two bottom shades are probably the least beginner friendly. They're quite hard to work with. The pop shade, although it looks really like vibrant blue, it's not very opaque, so it needs like a blue complement to really get that shadow to pop. This blue matte shade, a beautiful blue matte shade, but a little bit harder to work with, has the ability to not look as seamless as some of the other shadows that she has in her collection. So it's not a beginner palette, but I had a great time with this palette. So I'm not saying I'm definitely going to declutter this, but I'm saying it's ranking on number 9 because of just basically I've outgrown this color story, and it's not my favorite in terms of formulation. Then a bigger palette of number 8, it's this one. This is the Charlotte Tilbury Darling palette, a beautiful palette. I can always get a pretty look out of this. A little bit unmemorable if you ask me. I don't pull for this too much specifically because you can get a very beautiful warm tone eye with this one. And that's it. You can get a very beautiful warm tone eye with this one. Typically, my eye look will look peachy almost to the orange section. I wish that there was one deeper shade in here. So although I can get a pretty look out of this, I actually don't wear a lot of peachy eyeshadow looks. So I don't pull for this because of the color story, but I think that the concept of the 6-pan I really enjoy. I also really enjoy the finishes in here. This is a good formulation, and if this is your color story, this is a great palette to have. It's just a really nice travel friendly, well performing palette, and although I do think about it, I don't tend to use it as much anymore simply because the color story doesn't inspire me in any way, but it is a beautiful palette nonetheless. I'm almost halfway, and from this point on, it was getting pretty difficult to rank these. But on the number 7th position, I decided to put the newest palette that they have, the one that I have on my eyes, and that is the Queen of Luck palette. Not to be confused with the Queen of Glow palette. I reviewed this not so long ago, and this is a palette that has various formulations in one little palette. It has a really beautiful prime shade that you can use as your inner corner highlight. Great if you are fair toned because it does show up as an inner corner highlight on me. It has a duochrome enhanced shade, so if you see like the mirroring, you see that it has a duochrome gold to pink flip. On camera, it translates incredibly like bronze golden on me, but in real life, I actually have a lot of pink tones in here, and I wish that the camera did a better job of picking that up. I think matte shades for the smoke shade is definitely the way to go with these palettes. I think that that's where the success lies. You can smoke at the outer corner, but also use it as your kind of enhancing, contouring the eye type of shade. That's what I did today. And it has a golden pop shade. The pop shade I feel like is a nice performing pop shade, but not really the stunner of this palette. The duochrome is definitely the stunner of this palette. I really enjoyed this palette. I like the formulations. I like the duochrome is the flawless eye filter formulation, so it is a different formulation than the mattes and the metallics that you have seen so far. And I really like kind of that fairy dusting of the eye with this formulation. Overall, a very stunning palette. I have it on the eyes today. You can use it for every day and still have a nice pop of color. Beautiful. It's ranking a bit lower because of the palettes that you will see next. So I'll circle back to this palette a little bit later, but on the 6th position, I have this one. Another palette that has sentimental value in my collection, this is the Pillow Talk Dreams palette. This is a great palette if you're looking for a rose tone palette and your deeper complexion. The mattes in here are different performing mattes than all the other ones that I spoke about. These are pigmented and they feel like butter. I would actually compare this more to maybe like Natasha Denona type of shadows. They're not the same, but I'm just saying that in terms of pigment, the Charlotte Tilbury palettes were always kind of like the soft glam look, and I feel like Natasha Denona would always have these like high pigmented looks. When Charlotte Tilbury came out with this palette, I was like, okay, high pigmented looks. Another great thing about this palette, it has a super pop shade. So this is a pop shade, but it was much more opaque than all of the other pop shades that she has. Now this layers beautiful. You can get a very beautiful eye, smoky. If you like rose tone palettes, this is a beautiful palette. And what I also like about this palette is if you use the top row only, then you can get a very beautiful day toned eye if you're my complexion. So if you don't want to go all smoky, you can go day tone with the 2 top ones. My one but with this one is that the prime shade, although stunning, is not a shade that I can use for the inner corner highlight. I can get a dark cast with this one, so I don't have an inner corner highlight when I use this palette, but it's a very flattering palette on my skin tone, and because it's so versatile and it has a super pop shadow, it's ranking a bit higher than some of the other ones. I don't often pull for like, you know, very pigmented palette, but since you can, you know, go either way with this one, I do really enjoy this one. I want to add that I don't have the Fire Rose palette. The Fire Rose palette, it does also have a super pop shadow, and that seems to be like a favorite one amongst many of you. That one pulls, I think, a little bit more neutral. So if you are in Europe, there's still a Fire Rose palette out there. You can probably pick that one up. But if I can go according to this formulation, it's a beautiful formulation. So my number 5 palette is a difficult one to rank. This palette can either be like ranking really low on like specific days, or it can rank really high, like even 2nd place. And it was a favorite amongst many of you guys back in the day, and it's this one. This is the Exagger Eyes palette. This is a beautiful palette, probably has one of the best pop shades in here. It's a more neutral toned palette, so I would recommend this as your starter palette. And it has a really beautiful array of shades. Good inner corner highlight shade. It has a good enhanced shade, although the enhanced shade is a metallic, still performs really nicely. It has one matte, which is kind of this rose tone terracotta type of matte shade. I wouldn't recommend this palette for deeper complexions because it doesn't go that deep, but it gives you a very beautiful neutral looking eye, and probably one of the best pop shades out of all of these. This gives you this beautiful wet eyeshadow look. It is reminiscent to me as a like starter version of the Urban Decay Moondust shadow. I think this is a beautiful palette to have, and like I said, this would probably be the palette that I would recommend to people that are starting out with these type of palettes. If you enjoy a soft glam eye, this can give you that instantly. It's a complete palette. It always gives a beautiful eye look. It never has let me down. I think it's ranking on number 5 because it is right now not the one that I pull for quite often. I have other color stories that just suit me a little bit better. And what else can I say about this? It's a well-performing palette, but just not my favorite. It does have a lot of sentimental values because it's one of the first palettes I ever bought from Charlotte Tilbury. This is a palette that I sort of still force myself to look into, and every time I wear it, I'm like, oh, that is a beautiful palette. I should wear this more often. But it's not the palette that's on the top of my mind to pull for. Okay, remember when I said I would circle back to the Queen of Luck palette, so the newest palette that they launched? The other palette that I have in my collection that's ranking on number 4 is this one. This is the Charlotte Tilbury Celestial Pearl palette, and let's take a moment to appreciate the packaging on this. I have a lot of sentimental value when it comes to this palette. I bought this palette when my son was like a few weeks old. This is one of my first Charlotte Tilbury reviews. I have specific memories of wearing this palette while my son was sleeping and me trying to film like a 15-minute video. And every single time I pull for this palette, I think about that. I pull for this palette during like celebration time. So New Year's, for example. This is my typical New Year's palette. This is a festive eye. You're gonna get a pink prime shade. You're gonna get the same enhanced shade as the Queen of Luck palette. So they both have that similar flip where they do golden and pink. My Celestial Pro palette, of course, has been used like often. This is also a limited edition palette, and this has been discontinued. This has no mattes, but the enhanced shade is a little bit deeper than the terracotta brown from the Queen of Luck palette, and the topper shade is the pop is just, it should be a super pop. This is probably the most glittery top shade, or a pop shade, out of all of them. Altogether, it will give you a nice fairy dusting of the eye, very celebratory, not very deep, so it's a very like wash of color type of palette. I think in terms of packaging and formulation, this is such a great outing. It has the Flawless Eye Filter formulation in here as well, and even though there are no mattes in here, I think about this palette all the time. I think about specific occasions when to use this palette and when I pull for this palette, so that is the reason why I'm probably using this one over the Queen of Luck palette. And the Queen of Luck palette is just a little bit more neutral and a little bit more everyday, but it's also a little less special than the Celestial Pro palette, the names. So we're finally getting into the top 3 of my palettes, and I think the top 3 I feel really good about. I feel like they're right now the 3 palettes that I pull for the most, and I am someone that I'm currently not wearing a lot of eyeshadow palettes, so I'm not pulling for like crazy pigmented palettes, and I think you need to know that while going into this top 3, because I think that some of you might think that my top 3 is boring, but I'm a very boring person. So in the number 3 position is going to be this one. This is the Pillow Talk Original palette. This is a palette that I love. Every single time I pull for this palette, I get compliments on this palette, and I don't wear this palette for other people's validation, but I like getting compliments on the palettes that I wear, and personally I also see it. I think this is a great palette if you're a light to medium skin tone. It has a really great prime shade, one that you can use for your inner corner as a highlight. It has 2 mattes, so a really great contouring of the eye. And since this is a pink but it pulls a little bit like neutral warm, this can contour the eye really beautifully, and it has a really beautiful smoke shade, enough definition between the two to really have a beautiful rose toned eye. And it has a really nice rose tone pop shade that I really like. In an overall palette, I can see me wearing this more often if some of the other palettes were kind of decluttered. And I think about this palette a lot. If you like the Rosewood Dior Rosy Glow blush, this is a great complement to that blush. So sometimes when I want to do a monochromatic type of look, that's kind of the pairing that I do. So there's a specific need for me to wear this palette. I like this on every day. I like this in the springtime. So there is specific times that I really think about this palette a lot. I still pull for it. I like it more than its neutral brother, which is the Exagger palette. I feel like if you're a starter of Charlotte Tilbury palettes, I would probably recommend one of the 2. And the Pillow Talk palette used to have a lot of hype. Now Pillow Talk has been kind of overdone, and it's kind of like when people see the words Pillow Talk, we can almost roll our eyes. But back in the day, when she just had the Pillow Talk lipstick and then the Pillow Talk palette, oh my god, I was like loving the Charlotte Tilbury era when that was happening. Oh my god, you gotta see. Look at my dog. Okay, so my number 2 palette is a palette that is probably the palette that I pull for the most. Out of all the palettes you see here, the palette I still really pull for consistently as a complement to other palettes, as a palette alone, as a palette that I like to travel with, is this one. This is the Super Nudes palette by Charlotte Tilbury. It's a 6-pan palette. It came out in the Super Nudes collection, which is one of my favorite collections of all times. I'm so sorry if you hear my dog. And this is a great palette if you want to have those like cool tones, if you want to have definition, if you want to go for warm tones. It's an all kind of satin matte palette, so there's sort of like satins in here. It's a different formulation than all of the other ones that you've seen. And even though you don't have any shimmers in here, you can still get some really beautiful 90s like vibe eye looks in here. And it's a great complement to many of the other palettes. Now this is the second expand palette that I show in my collection. So the first one was the Darling palette. And you can actually see that even the warm tones in the Super Nudes palette are just a little bit deeper, and you can do a little bit more. It's just a little bit more versatile of a palette than the Darling palette. But the Darling palette does have shimmers, whereas the Super Nudes palette does not. I still think that the Super Nudes palette It looks boring, but is a palette that you should have if you're looking for a smaller neutral tone palette. In 2023, Patrick Ta came out with the Major Dimensions 3 palette. You have the Danessa Myricks Roundwear palette, and there are a lot of like neutral tone eye palettes in there, but if you're more of a smaller palette lover like I am, this is a great on-hand palette to have, and probably my most used palette. So in terms of most used, this should probably be on number one. Then the last palette, the number one palette, the palette that I love, I think about, I want to wear above all of these, is not a palette that is available anymore. I think this was a limited edition collection. She came out with 3 palettes of this collection. And the collection was called the Hollywood Flawless Eye Filter Collection. It also came out with the limited edition packaging. And this is the palette that is me. This is me in a palette. It's a Star Aura palette. This looks like nothing. It looks boring. It looks like it's gonna give you no definition, no nothing. As an everyday palette, this looks beautiful. It gives you this twinkling, this very fairy dusting of the eye. The color story, you know, it brightens up my eye, it opens up my eye. I absolutely am in love with this palette. And this is a standard where I measure some other palettes in my collection by that want to do a similar thing, but can't. I don't know what it is about this flawless eye filter, but both in performance and the way that it looks in the eyes, I really think it like knocks it out of the park. I enjoyed this formula immensely. I love that you can wear, for example, this shade, which is I think the prime shade. You can wear it on its own. You can get this really beautiful, like, I don't know, like fairy dusting off the eye. Like, I love this formulation. It is not a metallic, it's not a shimmer, but it's like all wrapped up into one, and they're so well performing. This is my favorite palette of all times. I wish the Charlotte Tilbury would come out with more of this formulation, and this is the one I recommend. If you can still get this one anywhere, like on a Poshmark marketplace type of idea, I would actually recommend this one if you're liking the kind of like open look of the eye, not too much definition. I think that if you're a deeper complexion, you probably won't like this palette and you don't like my number one ranking, but I have to be true to myself. This is the palette that I love. This is the palette that I still pull for and still fits in my current makeup aesthetics. So guys, that was my Charlotte Tilbury palette ranking. What did you guys think? Do you have a lot of these palettes like I do? I will be doing a declutter series pretty soon, but I want to actually look into my collection a little bit more. Maybe look into all of my bronzers, all of my blushes, you know, and really go into the nitty gritty before I start decluttering makeup that I absolutely love. And I have to be honest with myself and really keep palettes that I love. So therefore, this ranking was vital for me personally, but I also hope that you guys enjoyed it. Please make sure to thumbs it up if you did enjoy this ranking. Also, subscribe to my channel if you like Charlotte Tilbury and you want to check out my Charlotte Tilbury playlist. I will also list all of the palettes down below. My affiliates will be down below as well. If you have any questions, please make sure to use the comment section down below. I have the time to reply back to you guys. And guys, I just want to thank you guys all so much for watching and being here. So have a beautiful day. I'll see you guys next time.